So hello, and we start our fifth meeting on the rule of law and corporate actors talk. And today we will talk about the rule of law benchmark or index for social media and digital platforms. And we have all our meetings in the format of meetings, so you are free to join to the discussion. Just raise your hand. And I would like to give this floor to my good colleague Dmytro Vovk, who is chair of the Center of the Rule of Law and Religious Studies and visiting professor of Cardozo University. Dmytro, the floor is yours. Dmytro will moderate today's discussion.
Thank you, Elena. Hello, everyone. As you probably know, this edition of this fall talks is dedicated to the rule of law or in social media and digital platforms, and I don't think there is any sense to explain the importance of this topic, especially after what Elon Musk has done with Twitter. But of course, we have a variety of examples of when social media and digital platforms play important role in maintaining democracy and fighting against corruption. But we also know freedom of expression challenges and privacy concerns associated with social media. And in addition, many observers raise concerns regarding the power that social media and their owners have already obtained. And this is what we are going to discuss today. We have a panel of amazing speakers. Our first speaker is Yulia Razmetaeva, visiting researcher at Uppsala University in Sweden and the head of the Center for Law and Ethics and Digital Technologies at Yaroslav National Law University. Our second speaker, Barrie Sander, assistant professor of International Justice at Leiden University, Faculty of Governance and Global Affairs. Then Andrea Pin, full professor of comparative public law. Andrea also runs the master's program on law and technology at the University of Padova Law School. And the last but not least, Jan Rydzak, the digital sector transformation lead at the World Benchmarking Alliance. So our plan is to have a few rounds of questions on which panelists will be asked to comment. And this is for the audience. Once you have any questions or any comments you would like to share with us, please submit them to the chat and we will address them after each round of questions. Or if you would like, you can also raise your hand and we will give you the floor. So again, thank you so much to our speakers. And the first question that I'd like to ask you is why are social media and digital platforms critically influencing the rule of law today? Do they pose a serious threat to the rule of law in your view? Yulia, would you like to start?
Yes, thank you, Dmytro. I should say that I believe that social media and other types of digital platforms critically influence rule of law today. And of course, it's connected with their power digital platforms have, but this process is different from the ordinary process we have when something happens with rule of law. Because if the court had an unlawful decision, or if parliament has a place in the high court to the corrupt person, we can immediately see that there is a problem with rule of law. There is a problem with independence of judges, for instance. But when it comes to social media, that's not one-step process. That's something which is sometimes hidden from the general public, but it happens. And if it take an example of judicial independence, for instance, just let me create an analogy. The judge today is not a person who are someone in quiet judicial suite, something like library with books. It's a person which probably stay on a crossroads, being influenced by a lot of informational fluids, and sometimes that's accident influence, but sometimes it's direct intentional influence. It's something which used to manipulate of judges' opinion. And of course, it's quite impossible to be involved in landmark case and some process which has public interest and be not involved in anything what happens in digital environment. So yes, through social media, it's possible to influence opinions, and it's possible to form opinions in terms of both. It's possible to influence particular person who is judge, for instance, and it's possible to form something like artificial public opinion. There are many ways of this hidden indirect influence, and maybe my second example here, it's algorithmization. Social media platforms and companies who are behind them, it seems they formed a habit, and probably they push this algorithmization process quite recklessly. And doing this, they formed a widespread habit, formed some expectations in society, expectations connected with automated decision-making, for instance. And then some processes which are traditional for society, they're replaced by other. For instance, what we see as justice system is replacing by some online dispute resolution in the understanding social media platforms has about this process. Yeah, so I believe that the impact is quite serious, and that's why we should have some requirement, maybe some commitments to companies, at least at the minimum level of rule of law.
Thank you. Barrie, would you like to jump in?
Yeah, thanks. First of all, thank you to the organizers for having me. Very much appreciate being here. Real privilege. And thank you to all my fellow panelists as well. Yeah, so interesting question, obviously. I think what's interesting is to take a step back and just see the shift that's taken place over the last sort of 15 years or so, right? Because we may not remember this, but digital platforms were once hailed as forms of liberation technology, right? If we go back to the early 2010s, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter were hailed as platforms that can empower individuals and communities to communicate, mobilize protest, scrutinize government, expose wrongdoing. And of course, they do still have this function, this capacity. But over the course of the past sort of, I don't know how many years I'm going to let's say 8 years or so, we have seen this shift towards, what some have called this global techlash, where these platforms are now seen with a more critical eye. And I think that in answer to the question, there are 3 features really of digital platforms which maybe account for this more critical publicity that we've seen in recent years. The first is what I'll call the challenge of dominance. It's the fact that for a number of reasons, we have a small number of privately owned market dominant companies that have dominated the online ecosystem. Now, there are a range of reasons for that related to the regulatory framework within which these social media companies, particularly those in the US, grew up with, all kinds of laws around trade secrecy, contract, intermediary immunity, etc., which provided a favorable environment for the rise of these platforms, and created this particular structure of the online platform market. And essentially, this challenge of dominance poses a number of risks to rule of law, human rights, however we define it. First, we can see this in the lobbying power of these technology companies. They have replaced the financial sector as the biggest lobbyists. I think Google, Amazon, Facebook, Microsoft, and Apple in 2018 spent more than $60 million on lobbying in the US. So there's a huge amount of influence they have over political processes. Secondly, they have a kind of structural or systemic gatekeeping power over what is said online. So they have the ability to influence and shape discourse, how populations and communities communicate with one another, including politicians, including states, governments, and also they've altered the structure of the media market, right, through their accumulation of advertising power, which relates to that as well. They also have a less talked about, but also notable environmental impact. Okay, they are carbon emitters through their data servers as well, using a lot of water. Some of them provide services to oil and gas industry, and actually some have donated money to political candidates who deny climate change, right? And this is an existential risk already for many communities and for the planet as a whole. So the challenge of dominance, I think, is something we need to think about. Secondly, there's the challenge of data surveillance, because a lot of these platforms are run on business models that are driven by surveying personal data of users, both on and off the platforms. And this powers, the targeted advertising systems that they rely on and the engagement-driven amplification of organic posts towards making profit, essentially. So this data surveillance, which underpins a lot of social media platforms, also has a number of risks related to it, most notably in relation to privacy and security of our data and who has access to it. We saw with the Snowden disclosures back in 2013 that, governments have a real interest in getting hold of some of this data. And it's convenient, to say the least, that it's all centralized in a small number of privately owned companies. Also, in relation more specifically to targeted advertising, we've seen how this can influence negatively democratic discourse by enabling politicians to segment messaging to different, providing different messages to different groups, privatizing political debate, because not everyone sees the same thing online because all of the messages have been targeted at us, and even providing opportunities for voter suppression through that targeting. So there are a number of challenges around data surveillance. And then finally, the final challenge that I would suggest is the challenge around content moderation, right? Because online platforms are in the business of content moderation, right? It's what separates them from the open web, the way they organize, manage the permissibility and the visibility of online content. And in short, concerns around the way platforms have been moderating content have arisen from at least two perspectives. In some situations, platforms have been criticized for intervening too aggressively. For example, YouTube removed thousands of channels documenting human rights violations in Syria when it changed its algorithm a number of years ago. So taking down too much content, which should be legitimate and stay up. And on the other hand, they've been criticized for intervening not aggressively enough. And the classic horrific example here is Meta's operations in Myanmar, where it was criticized for for entering that market and not taking enough due diligence before entering that market and becoming implicated in the atrocities that were taking place against the Rohingya minority group. And the UN-sponsored independent international fact-finding mission in Myanmar, on Myanmar, I should say, did actually implicate Facebook in the hate speech that was being spread in Myanmar at that time. So these are the challenges that I would identify. And I'll just end with this one further challenge, which is, if these are the challenges to the rule of law, which we see on online platforms, we should also remember that we should be careful that the cure to these challenges is not worse than the disease, because actually state regulation also poses a potential challenge to the rule of law if they pass bad law in response to some of these challenges. And we can get into that maybe a bit later in the discussion. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Barrie. This sounds pretty much horrible, I would say. Andrea, would you like to give us your view?
Yeah, thanks for inviting me. I hope you don't expect me to give you a better picture of the scenario than what Barrie did. If we stick to the rule of law roadmap, I think that as far as the question goes, of course, the social media system and digital platforms at large have great impact on all the overarching themes of the rule of law. If you take one of the most thinnest understanding of rule of law, which revolves around the role of the judiciary, so the capacity of having a fair trial, the dynamics that we've been playing out in the recent years is just what has been dubbed the trial by media on steroids. It used to be the case, of course, that we were aware that bad journalism could shed a very bad light on people or during trials and prejudice the capacity to have a fair trial. But after all, you could sanction newspapers, right? Yeah, there were ways, there were codes of conduct that journalists should handle with. That's not the case anymore when it comes to social media. So patrolling the whole sphere, patrolling the viral aspect of online information, I think, has become impossible. And I think more of this later when we discuss other angles of the topic. If we switch gear and deal with the rights issue, there's one example, I think that one example that stands out in recent years. It's a Syrie or Syrie, whatever you want to call it, in the Netherlands. I'm sure Barrie knows very, very well. So that was a scandal. Let me just remind everybody, but I think already knows it quite well. So at some point, they in the Netherlands, they decided they would implement an algorithm. That's what they've done in good faith, just to make sure that people do not game the system and get welfare benefits just by frauding the system itself. The net result was that they detected frauds where there were no frauds. So people were kicked into poverty status because they were the benefits were withheld to them, and even the children were sent to foster care because the algorithm was not designed well enough. And so when it comes to rights, this is also a powerful indicator of the fact that if we rely on algorithm system to design rights, that is, and to diagnose whether rights are exercised and enjoyed properly, that's a big issue. The third and final point is that if rule of law includes democracy, of course we know that misinformation has become one of the trademarks of last decade. There are books out. Just if I can just mention one book, the Age of the Strongman is one of the most recent releases that show the impact of technology on politics. And I will end up here by saying that sometimes we identify the bad man, like saying this politician, this political platform surfaced just because of social media, because of how social media work. I don't think that's that simple. So we can just repudiate that political platform and things will just, as skies will clear up. Because this has just transformed the way we handle politics. Think of the changes in the party systems. I don't think that any party in the world looks like it used to look before social media. Now leadership and the dynamics between the platform and the goals of a party and the leadership has changed dramatically. And of course, we had a lot of spillover effects on the political process. So I'll stop here by saying that sometimes it's not just about who's using social media is going to be a bad guy, but the deployment of social media has informed and changed dramatically the way you understand politics.
Thank you, Andrea. And the final reaction on the first question from Jan.
Thanks, Dmytro, and thank you again for the invite. I should say I'm from a city in eastern Poland that's not too far from the border with Ukraine, with a strong Ukrainian community as well. So this invitation is really personally meaningful to me as well. And maybe to preface, I work for an organization that whose work revolves around benchmarking, right? So benchmarking companies on a variety of issues. We have a corporate human rights benchmark, a digital inclusion benchmark, which I oversee. But we also have benchmarks related to things like food and agriculture, climate, gender. So it's really heartening, I think, to see that early on in this conversation, we're already making some of the connections between these topics, just like what Barrie mentioned, with the environmental impacts. These topics are interconnected, right? So the environmental impacts of companies, tech companies or otherwise, are intrinsically connected to their impacts on society. So that's just a sort of headline that I think is worth sort of reiterating. And maybe so answering this question in particular, of course, digital platforms permeate every aspect of social life, and that includes rule of law. I think there are lots of legitimate arguments here. But I think in a way that impact is largely through the plethora of human rights that platforms touch, whether it's enabling or disabling or blocking access to or the fulfillment, I guess, of human rights. So I think that there's I guess my challenge to the rule of law concept is that it varies enormously by jurisdiction, right? And it can be applied in a relatively selective way. So one common dilemma that benchmarking organizations face is how to factor that in, right? So if you're evaluating, 200 technology companies like we do across, across the entire world, how much do we adjust for different regulatory differences, right? How much leeway do we give platforms if, for example, they cannot be transparent on a given issue? And I think more often than not, the conclusion that we come to is that there's the differences are so enormous, and regimes differ so vastly that that adjusting evaluations according to the law in a given jurisdiction is not productive, right? Because we need a common anchoring of some kind. And that's, I think, where human rights come in, right? Because human rights, I think this series has already focused strongly on human rights. There's a strong anchoring in European human rights standards, international human rights standards. And that really is the firmest framing that we have, right? It has specific instruments that are associated with it. It has specific expressions in ICCPR, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, a host of others that are, I think, well known to all of you in this family of treaties. The UNGPs, of course, sort of enter into play here. So there's this kind of gravitation towards anchoring ourselves increasingly in human rights standards because they are the sort of strongest foundation that we have. I think there's also an interesting point here in terms of companies' impacts. I think we tend to think of I think when people say digital platforms, they tend to mean social media platforms, right? And I think there's already, again, it's great to see the nuance in this conversation that it goes beyond the social media platforms. In many ways, the challenges that are for some people are specific to social media platforms also apply to other companies that have strikingly similar business models, even if on the surface that's not necessarily the case. So, for example, if you take an e-commerce company like Amazon, often thought of as operating in a separate universe from social media, but a lot of the core components are the same. They have a growing targeted advertising business that is increasingly sort of eating into the businesses of Meta and Google, which are the sort of dominant platforms or have been for the last decade or so. And if you dive into the disclosures that these companies were forced to make as a result of the implementation of the Digital Services Act, one thing that you'll find is that Amazon, for instance, Amazon revealed that it had taken, I think, 275 million actions to restrict and remove content from its platforms. And that's in the European Union alone, right? This is a company that is headquartered not in the European Union, but it's very clearly, operating on a scale in terms of content moderation, in terms of content governance, that is very comparable, I think, to social media platforms. Companies, by definition, I mean, inherently they have no company will just say, yes, let's disclose everything we possibly can and reveal all the government demands or our own actions to enforce our rules that we can without this extra pressure. And once this extra pressure comes, sometimes we see that in fact the scale of these operations is much greater than we possibly imagined based on sort of individual cases. So I think that's just a sort of flag to say that the impact is not limited to social media platforms. And I also would very strongly agree that on Barry's point about looking at the impact, but ensuring that there is no sort of disproportionate response on the side of governments. And I think this is an excellent theme, I think, to continue. But I think it is best left for sort of other questions in this discussion. I think we'll pursue it very vigorously.
Thank you so much, Jan. We have a question from the audience. Surprise, from Elena Varova. Elena, would you like to ask a question?
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you for great contributions. And yeah, my question is, if we are considering the rule of law as a set of restrictions of power, and in our previous talks there was a discussion about is it public power or is it private power or something else, but my question is, if the rule of law is a set of restriction of power, when we're talking about social media and digital platforms, this set of restrictions should be something like a self-regulation or state-based mechanism or something else?
Who would like to respond? Just speak up.
I can
yeah, sure, Andrea.
First kick if you wish. So it's interesting. Let's back up a little if you don't mind. So one of the things Europeans are famous for is because of a concept of privacy. Actually, this is one of the trademarks of the EU understanding of digital technologies and how we should go about regulating AI, right? Well, it looks like that we have a sensible privacy infrastructure when it comes to legislation. But the outcome is that we are being asking so much consent from our users that Rydzak some years ago published a book in which he gave a figure for that. If we had to so while we stay within the EU and our cookies requests pop up and forms us seeking approval for getting our data, it should take us 2 months a year just to read through the whole list of clauses. And it's not for lawyers. Lawyers will take even more because they will be more concerned. But average people will take 2 months a year. It's like reading the whole instructions before taking a pill, including if I'm pregnant. I can't be pregnant, I'm sorry. So I will just skip that part. But the way they are designed is intentionally tailored to push you to say, I consent, without reading whole infrastructure of law on clauses. So, surprise, surprise, as Dmytro said, when it comes to the Digital Service Act, that we recently implemented, the logic is that the user should be more informed. So you should give the user more information about what the digital. You can imagine that these simply cannot scale to the extent that we were talking about. So as for what's happening now, one of the most protective legal orders is actually relying so much on users that I don't think it's realistic. I'll stop here, but I thought that as just to start a conversation, this will probably give a sort of snapshot where we are at.
Thank you, Andrea. Any other comments from panelists?
Yeah, I have a short comment. I believe that it depends on paradigm, how we see the rule of law. Yeah, if I, for instance, see the rule of law as a principle, which is a part of triad, human rights, democracy, and rule of law, and rule of law includes some smaller principles, then I could say that we can ask companies to promote these principles, for instance. But even if it's a set of restrictions which government can pose, I'm not sure that, if it's something which is self-regulated, I don't believe that in self-regulation so much, because why social media could reject this power they already have. And speaking in line with something Barrie said about features of digital platforms, I need to say that there are some features of the platforms, as for instance, they aim to maximize involvement users being involved on certain platform, because it allows them to maximize the benefits. So if hate clicks allow social media to involve users, they will use it. Good or bad it for Myanmar, for instance. And also the platforms promote some good services and opinions without distinguishing between what to promote and whether it should be promoted. And that's a big power, I need to say. So probably self-regulation is not an option.
Thank you, Yulia. Barrie, would you like to jump in?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think I agree with everything that's been said. I would just say I think that an important starting point here is to the kind of characterization of platforms as governors. I think it was Kate Klonick where I first read this, whose work I first read this from. She described social media platforms as the new governors of speech. And that's important because I think whether we call it self-regulation or something else, it's important to recognize that platforms are already, they already have a kind of governance infrastructure of some kind in place. And so the question is, can platforms be kind of encouraged, using kind of soft power to kind of improve those kind of governance structures, or is a kind of more formalized legislative intervention necessary? And I think what we've seen over the past, again, I guess I'll pitch it for 8 years or so, is a shift from states being seemingly open to more kind of pressured self-regulatory approaches, putting pressure on companies to make necessary changes to their kind of structures and practices, to increasing impatience with that approach. And now we've seen, especially, for example, in Europe with the digital services package, that actually we are now seeing really tailored regulation of these types of spaces online. And so I think that there will always be a place for these internal governance structures, right? When those aren't going anywhere. And to the extent that social media companies, etc., want to put in place, expert review mechanisms like the oversight board that Meta put in place, that's fine. I mean, I don't think that's a problem. I think that that can be potentially quite useful so far as it goes, so long as it's not viewed as the solution, right? I think that's the key, right? It can be part of the conversation for sure, but I think that if we're going to have more of a kind of structural change to some of the challenges that I set out in my opening remarks, then certainly there needs to be some form of state intervention in this space. And then the real question becomes, what does smart state intervention, what does smart state legislation look like? What is human rights compliant state legislation of online platforms? And that's the really tricky question. And so I'll park that question for now.
Thank you, Barrie. It makes much sense to me personally. Jan, anything from you?
Sure, that's a really great question, Elena. I think I fully agree that too much flexibility is just not helpful, right? Self-regulation has failed time and time again on so many dimensions. I think the most charitable interpretation is that self-regulation has been insufficient in terms of advancing progress among social media platforms, but digital platforms writ large as well. I think there's a reason why, thinking back to very recent events, I think there's a reason why even in the US, the deal that the White House, or the informal sort of agreement that the White House reached on AI with some of the largest digital platforms was then paired with an executive order, not too long ago, which is, I hesitate to say this, but it's almost the extent, the sort of fullest extent to which the US is capable of regulating these platforms, because so many regulatory interventions immediately sort of hit this this hurdle of the First Amendment, which companies fully sort of use to protect their businesses and their business models. That's something that does not apply as strongly, of course, in the European Union, for instance. And I think there are many sort of illustrations of this, but I would want to highlight that in terms of content moderation, content governance, the fact is that the moment that the tech industry entered the sort of throes of the economic crisis, in the past couple of years, some of the first roles that were impacted by that were content moderators, were ethical AI teams, human rights teams. I'm sort of excluding Twitter in this case, because so much of the Twitter exodus was just directly caused by the takeover that occurred. But it is a sort of systemic issue, right? So and if we simply leave that to sort of regulate itself, I don't think we will ever have a guarantee that companies will dedicate the sort of amount of labor or the amount of effort, I guess, that we should expect of them in terms of simply content moderation. And then just one sort of last example here, and I hate to use Amazon as a sort of punching bag, but it's a very big punching bag. So I think it illustrates a lot of these examples. But last year, a group of shareholders that have sort of investments in Amazon filed a shareholder proposal asking for Amazon to disclose a transparency report on government demands for content removal, and Amazon strongly pushed back against that proposal. Choosing again not to disclose that information because it's for a variety of reasons, but among others, it stated that it would jeopardize its business and trust in its business. And the DSA again showed that the content interventions that Amazon implements are actually very extensive, and in fact, even in terms of government demands, it was the platform that received the largest number of government demands for content removal. So it's I think there's again an automatic incentive for platforms to default to non-disclosure until they're pushed to do so, whether by regulatory means or by sort of pressure from the general public or collective pressure from a variety of groups all at once.
Thank you, Jan. This is very interesting. You probably all know that there is a big debate over how we can and if we can measure the rule of law and what should serve as a methodology of measuring and so on and so forth. But again, we all know that there are some indexes of the rule of law, such as World Justice Projects and others. So my question is there any sense to assess the rule of law, to measure the rule of law specifically in the context of digital world, in the context of social media and digital platforms? And if yes, what should serve as indicators of the rule of law or no rule of law on social media and digital platforms? Yulia?
Yes, thank you. That's a really hard question, because to evaluate companies and rule of law, we need to understand what is rule of law, and we need to agree. Some may say that we cannot decompose the rule of law to the measurable components. For instance, if some people believe that there is a desire to justice inside of the rule of law or something like that, that's why maybe something like index or benchmark for social media regarding the rule of law could be less successful than indexes we already know, like rating of digital rights or corporate accountability index. But we can have some starting points. For instance, some indicators based on what Venice Commission proposed. In this case, we can have some components as access to justice, then equality, then legal certainty. Maybe for the social media, we can also use this idea which Paul Goder proposed. We translated several years ago. We translated his book from English to Ukrainian, the rule of law in the real world. And one of idea was that one of the components of rule of law is publicity. So that's maybe something which is important indicator when it comes to social media. As for methodology, I have an idea that the approach to the rule of law in social media is different from the approach we have if it's something we evaluate from the state point of view. So what we should, what could we demand from social media is this minimal level of rule of law. For instance, to have some remedies. If content people posted in social media was removed with any reason, and there is no one on the side, on the other side to speak, there is no possibility to claim that that was rightful content, that's something which is not compatible with the rule of law requirements. If all processes on the platform are algorithmized, and again, there is no possibility to restore your account. For instance, you have it for 10 years and you posted some things which you never posted in other places, and there was some intellectual property. So that's also against the idea of the rule of law. How we can measure this, what methodology, what indicators? Probably we can use some experience from the indexes we already have. For instance, we can have like a checklist. Do companies make meaningful commitments on the rule of law of the platform? Do companies or senior executives of the companies make a commitment to advance the rule of law on the platform? Yeah, something like that. But I have some doubts about measuring and weighting the rule of law, that is.
Thank you. Thank you. Barrie?
Thank you. Yeah, so first of all, I'm definitely not an expert on indexes or benchmarks. So I preface my remarks with that caveat. But I have looked into this in preparation for this talk a little bit. I think it's useful to just kind of sort of identify a few things of what we mean by a kind of index or indicators, or sort of what are some of the features, I guess. I talked about the features of digital platforms. What are some of the features of indicators? So I think one thing here that's important to recognize is that, you know, these indicators are not neutral, right? They're not neutral things that can be applied mechanically. They're normative tools that embed certain values and potentially shape behavior according to particular standards, right? So there's a political dimension to them, even the most seemingly neutral standards. So for example, if you take a census of the number of children and adolescents in a community, this will involve the non-arbitrary construction of the category of child. And what is considered a child may vary around the world. So, you know, even something as simple as that. So there's always a politics around the values that are embedded in any of these instruments. They're also inevitably reductive. And I don't mean necessarily that in a fully negative sense. I just mean it's inescapable, right? They are reducing a complex, something more, the complexity of the world into some kind of numerical indicator. And so clearly, if you do that, there will be some level of complexity that is lost. So it is a reducing of social phenomena to some kind of indicator. They're also vulnerable, right? They're only as good, these indicators, as the data on which they're based. And there may be, you know, issues around access to data which inhibits the ability to run these indicators effectively. They're selective, right, in terms of what they include and, you know, how they're aggregated. And I think it's also important to recognize they are potentially powerful, right? Because an indicator can send a message or seemingly send a message quite simply. It's something that can be reported in a news item very, very easily. So it's not something to be created lightly in a way, right? Because you're creating a potentially powerful form of communication. Now, obviously, in terms of, you know, would this be a good idea for social media? Would it even be feasible for social media? I mean, I think there is, you know, I mean, there's good work, really important work being done by a number of organizations already, which are using benchmarks. The one that, you know, that I'd already come across in my own work was Ranking Digital Rights, which obviously does important work at looking at, you know, the sort of compatibility of the processes and systems and transparency of those systems of social media platforms with human rights standards. And it seems to me that in thinking about what is most likely to go into a kind of rule of law index for social media platforms or for digital platforms more generally, it seems to be more the kind of procedural dimensions of these questions, because those are the things that are easier to measure. So if you look at Ranking Digital Rights, if you go on their website and you look at some of the indicators they rely on, it's all things around transparency and accessibility of the governance structures and the community standards of companies. So is there or is there not a human rights policy? Is it how, you know, do they have a detailed guidance on freedom of expression standards? You know, things like this. And I think, you know, that's useful and important, right? You know, do they disclose the kind of relations they have with states and around privacy and sharing user data? This is all really important stuff. And I think that, you know, that there is value in that. I guess my concern really with all of this is that there is a risk that in the kind of reduction, of the complexity, that it becomes that I think I read in the literature, rather than what is measured gets done, it's what is easy to measure that gets done. And I think that there's a danger here in that those things that are easiest to measure in this conversation get prioritized in the conversation at the expense of more complicated concepts that may be more difficult to tackle. So, for example, well, let's take an example. If you imagine you had an indicator which was, has your company translated community standards, your community standards, into all of the languages of the communities in which you operate? Okay, which could be useful to know that information, right? Has, you know, are the community standards accessible in all the different languages where the company operates? But of course, that indicator will tell us nothing about, for example, the quality of the translation, the accessibility of the translation, the digital literacy of the population that's accessing that document. And so you could end up, I mean, I know I'm being very selective here, but just to make a point, I guess, you could end up with a very high score on that indicator, but it might actually occlude a number of different things on the quality side. And I think that's one of the major challenges here. There are a few other things I could say, but I don't want to take too much time. So maybe I'll leave it there for now. Thanks.
Thank you, Barrie. I think that it's also very relevant to measure in the rule of law in general, right? You can have, as you said, very high scores, but it could be too formal or too subjective in reality. Andrea?
Yeah, thanks. I can certainly echo what has been said already. And I think that the main takeaway for what has been said so far is that we can treat digital platforms as well just a market, which has often been the case. They're not just a market. It's a highly political and legal and social phenomenon, which is very complex and multi-layered. And I think we're getting to that point that we understand that it's not just about market and expecting that market self-regulate itself. When it comes to what is feasible, and of course I understand I'm tempted to do what is feasible rather than what is just, Barrie. I agree with you. As I mentioned, one of the main concerns for me is, of course, how platforms disrupt politics and political process. I think one of the main issues, of course, is clean up the information field. So how we retrieve information, how we process information. I'm pretty confident everybody here is familiar with this very weird scenario in which we are watching the news of some very prominent and respected outlets, and the argument who's giving us the news is actually watching a smartphone. So you're wondering why you're not just watching a smartphone. You would like to know what kind of sources they have, that they can't simply share the screen of what they are watching. And I think this is one of the paradoxes we are facing. In order to clean up the information field, I think that we should reconsider in several countries that are familiar with this notion, the ethical codes for journalism. We can't simply rely on sources that are unverified. So pushing a journalist to be good journalism in the sense of verifying sources, making transparent when sources is credited or not, also reputation rank about sources. And of course, this cannot be done by single entities, single newspapers or journalism outlets. I would say that this is just doable if it's done by collective entities. And this is very much European continental tradition, not just a European continental, but we have a decent tradition of understanding that information is not just a market, it's something else, and it has a lot of power, and we can put constraints because of the power it has. Besides that, I think that the best, some great job is done by the big test scorecard, but I give the floor to who comes next then.
Thank you, Andrea. And the final comment from Jan, and then we will turn to Natalia's question.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dmytro. I have to say I really love this question, and especially, well, really all the interventions so far have been fascinating. But you know, this is a moment of full disclosure. I worked for Ranking Digital Rights for almost 4 years before taking on my current role, so I'm deeply familiar with that methodology, but also how it compares to other methodologies out there. Other benchmarks, and I should also emphasize that the WBA is a large organization that has, as I mentioned, lots of benchmarks on a variety of topics, but it's not the only one out there, right? And that's, I think, the point I really want to highlight, that there is no silver bullet here, right? And every approach that we take to measuring the performance of companies will have its flaws, will have its detractors, its vigorous supporters. But I think the goal that we should all seek is that they should communicate with each other, right? Should complement each other in various ways. Just to give you a very simple example, the RDR Big Tech Scorecard and the Telco Giant Scorecard, which RDR also produces, both of these focus on individual services largely, right? So in the case of Meta, for example, it would be Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, and Messenger. And there are some indicators that focus on the overall sort of company level, right? So in particular, there's a governance category that looks at who is accountable, who what kind of training is provided to the employees of the company in terms of human rights, protection of freedom of expression, privacy, and so on. So all of that is very much by design. But to sort of echo what Barrie said, there are trade-offs that inevitably come with that, right? One of those trade-offs is that it's simply impossible to operate at a scale that would cover all the largest companies, all the largest services across time every single year, right? And still sort of strive for a degree of accuracy, right? It's in many ways it's a very nuanced and complex methodology, but with a small, if it's overseen and implemented by a small team, it's simply too much labor to be frank, and that's where I think the sort of collective part also comes in, because it is ultimately not going to be one organization that provides the shining light to guide how companies should operate. In a way, so one approach that we're taking is that there's a set of indicators that cut across all of our benchmarks. They're called the core social indicators. And they consist of things like commitments to respect human rights due diligence, but the different components of human rights due diligence, remedy and grievance processes, again, alluding to what Yulia was mentioning. And these concepts take on very sort of particular and tangible forms in the case of digital platforms. I'm not sure if you all recall, but when COVID began, this is a bit of a dated example at this point because it's 3 years old, but Facebook's appeals mechanism collapsed entirely for 3 months. And that means, that they went from millions of appeals per quarter to practically zero. They just, could not handle the pressure of the number of appeals that they were receiving in light of all the changes that were happening alongside COVID. And, for 3 or 4 months, that sort of persisted, right? Ultimately, I think it's not something that grabbed all the headlines at the time, but it's just notable that these systems can collapse, and things like that are, they're qualitative indicators essentially, right? It's not about the number of appeals, but the fact that it happened, and examining some of the impact of that. I do think that, whatever approach we take should follow some sort of overarching principles. One of them, to me, one universal principle is public disclosure, right? So either whether it's policies or interactive guides, Facebook is experimenting with that in some ways. You shouldn't have to log in to understand how the platform works and how it protects its users. That's inherently, again, it touches on the business model question that Barrie raised, right? If you have to create an account and log into a platform, that by default means that you're giving the platform some of your data, and that should not be the cost of transparency. And I think another principle here should be clarity, right? I believe Andrea made this point, that you don't need a 40-page user agreement. You don't need to, have to scroll through that, especially since it tends to be buried in, the bowels of a website, to understand what kind of protections the platform has in place. So the starting point should be a focus on the individual regular user, right? It has to be comprehensible to a regular user. And then I think we should also recognize that the services that we're talking about, again, they have some common points, but they also differ in so many ways, right? So you can't necessarily expect a fully encrypted messaging service, for example, to disclose how much messaging content it's shared with governments, because by definition those platforms don't have access to that content themselves. But you should expect that of a conventional social media platform like Facebook or Twitter, even messaging platforms that are not fully encrypted, right? So any digital service that doesn't have the sort of automatic protections in place. But again, if you apply those, sort of layer those degrees of complexity over each other, again, sort of pivoting back to Barry's point, you can quickly get to a level of complexity that's not sustainable for any single group of people. And I think in the end, benchmarks will only ever be a proxy for human rights performance or rule of law performance, rather than like an absolute measure of anything. The trick is how do we get them all to work together?
Thank you, Jan. I think Barrie has some addition.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on something Jan said about, when all the appeals kind of collapsed, because it just made me think that if I were to propose one indicator that could be useful, I think I'd propose a human moderator satisfaction indicator, like to see how the human moderators are doing, because I think that's something that gets really overlooked here. We're always thinking about what expression gets left up or taken down or prioritized and how that impacts society. But I think those who actually do the work, those people, real people who are actually doing a lot of this work and working on the appeals, they're kind of forgotten about. And to the extent there has been investigative journalism and books written, I know Sarah Roberts has got an amazing book on this, for example. It's quite horrific. They're underpaid, bad working conditions, poor training, not great psychological support. I would say that is something that could maybe be measured and actually, ranked. Maybe there would be value there, right? Because I think that is an area that needs urgent attention. So maybe that could be something that could be useful here. Thanks.
Thank you, and thank you, Barrie. And I have a question from Natalia Mishina. The question is, what role can international cooperation play in establishing and enforcing rule of law standards for social media and digital platform? Jan has already touched upon that, but maybe you have some additions. And actually, what is coming to my mind is an interesting sort of consensus that I think we have now in the international level, that we should somehow restrict social media digital platforms. And this consensus comes from two very different sort of actors. First of all, there are democratic, I should say, Western countries which would like to regulate this stuff in order to protect human rights. But also there is a request to regulate the sphere from authoritarian regimes, which would like to restrict social media in order not to have one more Arabian Spring. So, and I think it's a very interesting geopolitical context for this sort of regulation. So any thoughts on that?
I can jump
Barrie,
in.
go ahead.
Just to get things going. I think it's useful maybe to distinguish the different kind of clusters of issues, because some of them there's more, it will be easier to get cooperation on than others, right? We've already seen when it comes to, for example, AI regulation, that countries are coming together to talk about, you know, how it all knits together. When it comes to things like data protection, there has been a lot of synergies between the approaches that countries are taking. I think so when it comes to questions of data, for example, or more technical matters, maybe there's more room for countries to kind of knit together their approaches. But I think when it comes to freedom of expression and content governance, there, I think we already have, you know, the major human rights conventions, which set out the kind of very broad standard of freedom of expression. And I would be very wary of reopening that to a more specific level at the international level, because I think that the conversation would break down very quickly, because, you know, different countries have such different expectations of what they consider to be freedom of expression, right? You've got the First Amendment approach of the US, you've got Europe, which is a bit more interventionist, you've got China, for example, Russia, which is much more interventionist on what's allowed online. And I think it's unrealistic to expect that these countries would come together and be able to kind of formulate some kind of even standards, frankly, around freedom of expression online. I think that, you know, the approach we have right now is we have the right to freedom of expression set out in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And it really should be about sort of enforcing that and translating that into more specific ideas for the online space. So I think that's where the energy is. And that, you know, there are, you know, if you look at the UN, there are a lot of fora in the UN that are trying to do that, to try to move forward that kind of conversation.
Thank you, Barrie. You got some support in the chat already. Who else would like to jump in? Okay, and the final round of questions is about strategies, or if you will, principles of regulation of social media and digital platforms in order to sort of ensure more rule of law in the digital world. What, in your view, should be those strategies or principles? You don't have to sort of depict the whole picture, but what is crucial to implement in this area in order to have more rule of law in digital world? Yulia?
Yes, thank you. As for strategies, what is crucial? First of all, it's crucial to regulate the reckless and irresponsible promotion of certain technologies by companies that own digital platforms, and particularly social media, let me say AI. And I really like the strategy the European Union has with the Digital Service Act. And you know that there is a term very large online platforms in this act, because the logic behind was some platforms, some search engines must be obligations that are proportionate to their social impact. And if it's a platform which has 45 million of active users within the EU, it's a very large digital platforms. But as for me, even Digital Service Act, which companies see as very restrictive, is not enough. It's not restrictive enough. For instance, that's hard-headed approach, I think, because that's hard to define who is active recipient of servers, who is active users. If I have 10 accounts, how to count? Is it 10 users or is it 1? And of course, to define who is behind these accounts, it could come very we could come in very intrusive way. I mean, to use data not limitlessly. Yeah, on the other hand, I believe we should have more restrictions when it comes to large digital platforms. On the other hand, it's hard to say how we will impose these restrictions and how we will follow them, how we will trace is it successful in the case of social media.
Thank you, Barrie.
Thank you. Yeah, obviously a massive question. I think that I'd probably begin with a comment by Cory Doctorow from the Electronic Frontier Foundation in the US, who says that societies kind of need to decide, do they want to fix big tech or do they want to fix the internet? And by that, what he means is, if we look at, for example, the Digital Services Act, essentially what it does is it leaves big tech in place and just tries to kind of make it better, right? So it's trying to make a more benevolent version of what we have, right? And that is one approach, right? That's one approach to take. But another approach, which is kind of hinted at in the Digital Markets Act, but not fully followed through with, is to try and open up these platforms to greater interoperability, to try and pluralize the online platform ecosystem, so that we sort of reduce the dominance of the biggest platforms that we see today, to try and create much more digital spaces online, sort of like when the internet first started out. And those are two very different models and ways of thinking about the internet, right? One relies on, keeping the current kind of relative dominance of the current big tech companies, but trying to make them nicer, should we say? And the other one really tries to restructure the entire marketplace. And some would even say, to demarketize, actually go even further, right? To actually just completely demarketize this space because it's a public space and it shouldn't be commodified in any way. So I think that societies need to decide, and the regulators need to decide what model they're interested in. The EU seems to have made its decision to some extent with the Digital Services Act, I would say. And then I think if you are going for that approach of kind of making big tech sort of more benevolent, then I think what we need to see, and we maybe are beginning to see with the Digital Services Act, let's see, it's too early to tell, but is a move away from looking at, for example, these issues in a very narrow sense of what content is taken down and what content is left up, in looking at kind of individual content decisions, to a much broader systemic approach. And we see this in the Digital Services Act with this idea of systemic risk, right? So the very largest platforms are required to conduct these risk assessments to identify systemic risks on their platforms and to take mitigating measures against those risks. And all of this will be audited. And I think, there is real potential there to, make more structural changes to these platforms if that systemic risk process is implemented effectively. So that would move the conversation away from individualized leave up, take down content decisions to more questions such as, how is the platform designed, right? Is it designed in a way which is able to kind of put more roadblocks for the spread of disinformation? What about the business model? Is the business model something that should be altered? And we've already seen, litigation over whether behavioral advertising should that be banned in its entirety, right? Should we just move to a more contextual advertising model because of the negatives that are associated with behavioral advertising? And then looking at the kind of, like I said, the standards of human moderators, are they well looked after? Are the algorithms, what are the kind of indicators that are going into the algorithms which determine which content is prioritized and how content is ranked? And I think if we can take that more systemic approach and include those most affected negatively by content decisions online from vulnerable communities, minority communities, and we can feed in that information into the process, then I think that offers one sort of promising way forward. The final point I'll make is we should also remember, and I think someone made this point earlier, that we're not going to solve these problems by solving online spaces, right? A lot of the challenges that we see online are merely, sort of, I don't want to say reflections because they're not just reflections, but they're rooted, let's say, in wider societal dysfunctions, right? So you can create the most amazing online system with all the checks and balances and get everything right, but those problems will, to some extent, remain because they are societal problems, right? Disinformation and all these things, they're rooted in societal problems, and so we shouldn't forget that, right? We should remember to keep an eye out for the broader picture here as well.
Thank you, Andrea.
Thanks. Of course, the question is very difficult to not just to solve but to address. I would say a couple of things. Of course, it's difficult not to fall prey of the paternalist trap. So you're given impression that you're patronizing people. I would say that if you look at the reality of the ground, I'll give you just one example. The 80% of resources that Facebook investing moderating the platform are located in the United States. So just 13% of resources are used to moderate, to mitigate the environments outside the United States. So funding is an issue. It's money. And this is not a platonic consideration, also because of one of the things that have characterized development of regulation technologies in the EU is that because the EU has very limited budget, just 1% of GDP compared to the 20% of American GDP, which is in the hands of federal Congress. So 1% is nothing. So what we have been doing is pushing forward by regulating, and sometimes regulating is not enough. So to some extent, you need to subsidize the good people in the society, meaning that you need to help them rely less on engagement of people, and to some extent to become more independent and focus on the goal they're supposed to pursue. Of course, this is derailing from the mostly American stereotype of AI and digital technologies as a market that is self-sustaining, but that's an option. The other thing is that, but I think we already discussed that, the development of bipartisan or multi-partisan bodies that handle these issues. You can't leave this to the single market protagonist. I second Barry's idea that systemic issues must be treated as systemic, not just very punctual issues that need a very, very sharp intervention. And I will just end up by saying that there's a new season, at least within the EU, of integration of more countries from Eastern Europe, and this will be a good time to resuscitate the topic, because of course, and this of course harkens back to what was said before. If we consider these aspects within the integration process, we may have more leverage, because it's basically pushing more countries to consider this as a strategic points that can address while pursuing EU integration. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Andrea. Jan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and excellent question again. So I think maybe counterintuitively, I would like to start by drawing a line in the sand in terms of what I think we well, what I strongly believe should not be done. Excuse me. And for a lot of people, I think that line in the sand is shutting down platforms and banning them entirely. Right. So, restrictions to transparency, restrictions to platforms of all kinds, whether it's the business model or the operations of the entire platform, they can take a lot of different forms. They can be formal, informal, indefinite, temporary, but shutting them down is a sledgehammer, essentially, right? The sort of nuanced interventions that we're talking about are sort of in one universe, and complete suspension of access is in another universe. But unfortunately, it happens a lot, right? And it's happened a lot for more than a decade now. In some years see enormous increases of social media platforms being completely shut down in a given country, sometimes temporarily, sometimes permanently, and that has enormous ripple effects that are often hidden, and it also speaks to the point that the companies involved in these cases, it goes beyond social media platforms, right? Because the companies that are often tasked with those sort of draconian measures are actually telecom operators. So in fact, that's 99% of the cases. So it's important, I think, to note that regulatory interventions of any kind, whether they're formal or informal, they sort of inherently go beyond the sort of sphere of social media platforms. Just yesterday, I believe the government of Nepal announced that it would be banning TikTok on the grounds that it, I think, disrupts social harmony was the phrasing. So again, I think it's just not a high enough bar to justify action on such a scale, and it strips the whole conversation of the degree of nuance that I think it really requires. But at the same time, I very strongly seconding Barry's point on regulating targeted advertising business models. This is kind of where the story begins in the end, right? All the incentives that we are talking about, whether it's the spread of disinformation or amplification of harmful content, this is what creates those incentives in the first place, and the tech industry as a whole is addicted to it. In many ways, it's like an inescapable reality that nobody has truly found an alternative for, and it's very easy to assume that the more we regulate, the more it will go away. But that's not really the case, right? So I think many of you may be aware that in the EU, Meta is giving people a choice between subscribing for, I believe, 15 euros a month or so, and just complying essentially with the targeted advertising business model and seeing those targeted ads, which is in many ways a false choice. I think most people will go for the easy option, the illusion of consent, I think, as Andrea was saying. So it's platforms will naturally try everything to hold on to that business model because it is sort of the holy of holies, right? That's where they came from, and that's what they'll stick with for the foreseeable future. I do think that regulation in that direction can work together with a transparency focused approach. Again, in the US, you will often hear voices insisting that transparency focused regulation is a slippery slope to government intervention, that it's compelled speech. But again, that naturally sort of undercuts efforts to get companies to come clean. And I would say that, transparency-focused measures like the DSA are also not in a vacuum, right? So the data that is able to elicit from companies is also kind of a gateway to further action, right? Whether it's campaigns that target those companies, it is sort of additional data points that give us a more comprehensive view, I think, of the company's operations. So I fully agree that, and I think as several of us have said, that this is, focusing on transparency is not the end all. That's certainly not the extent of the interventions that are necessary, but it's a component of a larger whole, I think. And maybe the last thing to say here, there's so much more I think that we could get into. I think corporate accountability is it should be a distributed effort, right? Again, no single entity should be responsible for holding companies accountable. There are many examples of adaptations of methodologies that have been implemented by individual civil society groups. But on the sort of, going to the question that Natalia asked about international cooperation, I mean, there are attempts at interventions like the Global Digital Compact, right? But I think when we talk about that as a regulatory instrument, it's rife with problems, and I think because of how the international system works, it's very hard to get consensus, and it's very easy for that to fall apart for the most trivial reasons, right? Just the fact that the Global Digital Compact is supposed to coincide with the Internet Governance Forum, which is taking place supposedly in Saudi Arabia next year. I mean, things like that can truly undermine international efforts if an important international document is sort of undercut by the fact that the major international internet conference is happening in a repressive regime that has sentenced people to death for tweets. So those things can really derail those processes, and I think we just should keep that in mind.
Thank you so much, Jan. Thank you to all our panelists for this enormously fruitful interventions. I personally learned a lot, and I have my own interest in that because I teach the rule of law, and I got so much interesting material specifically for the topic, the rule of law in digital world. And Olena and I, we are sending our fufus to all participants who registered but didn't show up, not because we don't like them, but because they really missed a good opportunity to learn for such incredible specialists in this field. Thank you so much. And Olena, anything from you?
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, it was very, very interesting, and we are going to prepare the working paper with overview of all our talks. So yeah, I hope that we will share your very interesting thoughts via the working paper, and also we have records. So yeah, I really hope that much more people will learn from you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much. Take care, everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you very much. Have a nice evening.